Roger McGrath, author of more than 4 books, a bunch of columns and book reviews over the years. He taught American West and California history at UCLA for 15 years. Roger, you were just telling us about this black man who came here as a slave. He was indentured, and he had a slave, or a man he thought was a slave, who wanted to work for a neighbor. The neighbor took Johnson to court to get the court to determine that the slave was not a slave but an indentured servant, and therefore could work for the white neighbor. And then what happened?
Well, the court found in favor of Anthony Johnson, because the slave in question, he's been called John Kasser, had never signed a contract of indenture, had been a slave in Africa, had been brought to the Caribbean as a slave, and then stolen from a Portuguese slave ship and sold in Virginia. And so this set the precedent for slavery in the American colonies there in the 1650s.
Now, Roger, how ironic is that?
Well, absolutely.
I mean, honestly.
Absolutely. So the first formal legal slaveholder in the American colonies was a black man. And here's something else that's ironic, too, and that was in Virginia in the 1650s. By 1700, there was only 6,000 black slaves in Virginia. Only 6,000. Them only made up about 7% of the population of Virginia. And it probably would have remained at that very low number. Slavery never would have developed to any large degree in America, except for something else that was brought in from Africa, and that was malaria. Malaria came in with mosquitoes, and it came into the American South, and malaria took a tremendous toll on all these white indentured servants. There are plenty of them, plenty of Irish and Welsh and English and everything, all these indentured servants. They would have filled the labor of the southern colonies, easily filled it. But malaria took such a great toll of them. And blacks were protected from malaria because of the sickle cell. And we only think of sickle cell today because of sickle cell anemia. So we think of it as a bad thing. There's too many sickle cells. But the sickle cell protects blacks from malaria. And that's the only reason black slavery developed in the Old South, because of the high death rate from the Anopheles, female Anopheles, a mosquito biting people, malaria, and that came from Africa too.
Doctor, when you hear people say slavery built America, but for slavery, America would not be the prosperous nation it is today, what's your reaction to that?
Well, quite the opposite. Slavery kept the South pretty much as a feudal society, an agrarian feudal society, which today we would say backwards, And while the North was industrializing and growing rapidly, and most of the immigrants were coming in to the North, and that's the reason the North won the Civil War. North didn't win the Civil War because it had better fighting men. North won the Civil War because it had built up rail lines and industry and supplies that the South couldn't possibly match, because slavery had kept the South backwards as an agrarian society, and economically impoverished huge areas of the South. You have to remember, slavery, the despicable, abominable institution that it is, not only hurt those enslaved, but it hurt all these free whites that couldn't compete with these big plantation owners that bought up all the good bottomlands, the fertile bottomlands, and pushed all these whites off into the piney woods or rocky mountaintops in the South. So the South didn't get the really strong middle-class development that the North got. So in a way, the slavery is a great millstone on the development of the economy of the South, and really kept it in a feudal agrarian state.
Roger, we only have 2 minutes left in this segment. I remember reading that when Frederick Douglass escaped a plantation, and I think he went to Massachusetts, he walked around and he was stunned at how prosperous that state was, how prosperous blacks were. Some of the blacks were more prosperous than some of the most prosperous white men where he was. And he did not realize you could become successful without slavery. He didn't think any nation or any state could become prosperous without slavery. He was shocked.
Well, think of all those guys like we're tearing down now, Robert E. Lee or something. Well, Arlington, which became Arlington-Abbey's plantation there. Well, all of those people were not making money. Most of those people were in great debt. In fact, if they manumitted their slaves, the slave would be re-enslaved because they would say it's like somebody trying to hide assets in bankruptcy. They had a very difficult time of it, because they weren't making money. The old tobacco plantations, they had leached all the nitrogen out of the soil. And those plantations, as good as they looked on the outside, most of us were facing bankruptcy, and they were having terrible problems. And that's why the only place slavery was really working, and this is only agriculturally, was in these new areas of the South, pushing into Alabama and East Texas and places, the new cotton lands that were developing. And that's another irony, because cotton was not a crop of the old South until they developed this new short staple up country cotton that could stand a frost. And then they had to develop also the cotton engine or cotton gin to be able to separate the seeds from the cotton fiber. Otherwise, that crop wouldn't have been profitable.
Roger, we're going to take another break right here. We come back, I want to ask you about the impact of the novel Uncle Tom on the Civil War. By the way, in the novel, Harriet Beecher Stowe mentions that the cotton gin was invented by a black man. And I want to ask historian Roger McGrath about the role of Arab slavers out of Africa.